Hey everyone, Kibler here, and today I want to talk to you guys about the Year of the Phoenix. I was on the stream that revealed all the various details, but that was more of a, reveal and talk about the details of things with some folks from the Hearthstone team, rather than an opportunity for me to share my thoughts on everything that's been announced. So I'm not going to use this as a card review video. Those are going to be coming later. I want to talk sort of big picture about all the things that were announced. So let's start with what I consider sort of the quality of life changes. The no duplicate changed to packs, the free deck for returning players, and the ranked revamp. So both the no duplicate and free deck for returning players, I think, fall into the category of stuff that makes Hearthstone more accessible, cheaper, easier to play, and to some degree, so does the ranked revamp. When Hearthstone launched, what was it, 6 years ago at this point, it was actually a very affordable game compared to other collectible card games in the market. If you compare it to Magic Online, those sort of games, like they were vastly less expensive. But as time has gone on and other games have been trying to compete with Hearthstone on cost, it has become significantly more expensive relative to competitors. And frankly, just as it has introduced more cards, more sets, more content, it has legitimately gotten more expensive. So Hearthstone's been kind of concerned about this. The community's been concerned about this for a long time. And they're taking pretty significant action here with the no duplicate policy in particular, which means that you can never get a duplicate copy of a card that you have the max number of copies you can play of. Already applied to legendaries before now, but now will apply to commons, rares, and epics as well. This dramatically reduces the number of packs that you need to open to get a set of a particular, expansion. And in particular, like the change to epics, like how many times have you had like 6 copies of one epic and you can't find another one? Like if I look through my collection for missing, almost universally the things that I'm missing are epic cards, because there are a bunch of them and you need 2 of each of them in order to complete your collection. So this is a huge change that will dramatically reduce not only the cost of playing Hearthstone, but also just sort of the frustration of like opening packs and being like, keep getting duplicates, not getting what I want. It'll make opening packs a lot more fun. It's not just like, okay, open. Eventually, like the only thing you care about is legendaries, and you're gonna get to the end of it and be like, okay, I still need all these cards. That's just not gonna happen if you open a bunch of packs anymore. I think if you get the pre-orders, you're pretty much guaranteed to get all the commons and rares and most of the epics or something like that, which is a pretty great system overall. And with the free deck for returning players too, if you're someone who's been away from Hearthstone and you're like, what, all this stuff sounds awesome, Demon Hunter coming, big new expansion, cheaper to play in general, you get to come back in, and the scare of coming back into a game like Hearthstone is, I've been away so long, I won't have anything that I can really play, I can't be competitive. Well, if you get a free deck that is the equivalent of a competitive deck with epics and legendaries and everything, maybe it's not necessarily 100% optimal, but it gives you a great baseline to start from, and that's huge. It gives you an opportunity to jump right in and compete, and that's true for new players too. If you haven't played Hearthstone before, it's obviously another great time to jump in to get that free deck and be able to compete. On top of that, the ranked revamp, I think, is generally just a good thing. For those who may have missed the video, there are now going to be 5 leagues with 10 ranks within leagues, going from bronze to diamond with legend still at the top. And you will advance through these leagues and have additional ranked floors every 5 ranks within a league. And every rank will have 3 stars rather than jumping around. Some have 3, some have 5, some have 4, whatever it was before. And you'll now always drop down to bronze 10 at the beginning of the season, but you'll get a star multiplier based on your previous results that will advance you much faster through the ranks. And this is valuable for a couple of reasons. One, it means that everyone feels like they're actually progressing. One of the issues was, you got to, like, say rank 5 before, and it dropped you down to, I don't actually know where rank 5 gets dropped down to, let's say rank 9 or 10. it's like you're just gonna struggle to get back up to 5, and it doesn't feel like you're making that much progress. Whereas now, you always will like be progressing through, and you're getting rewards based on your progress, both first-time rewards from whenever you hit a new rank, and end-of-season rewards, which are much more significant, much more generous than before. It used to be that they were gold cards, which I guess the idea was, oh, hey, end-of-season, we want it to be a kind of prestige thing, and they viewed gold cards as this prestige thing. But realistically, people don't really want gold cards for the most part, unless they're lunatics like me, who just have everything already and just want to have, you know, their blinged out decks. What they want is cards they can play with, and getting, you know, individual cards and packs of cards, which the new reward system gives a lot of now, comparatively, like a lot more. In addition to those first-time rewards, it's just overall, you know, more free stuff that you get for interacting with the system. Additionally, you'll just generally get better games, because rather than pairing by ranking now, they're going to be pairing by matchmaking rating, which is generally your overall skill level, or at least the skill level that the system thinks that you're at. Which means that if you get, you know, dropped down to rank 10 at the beginning of a season, you won't be playing against other rank 10 players who are legitimately rank 10 when maybe you're a, you know, rank 3 legend, whatever type player. You will be playing against players who are, you know, of equivalent skill level to you, so you'll have good matchups, good games for the entirety of your climb, or at least that's the idea. So overall, I think there's just a ton of positive changes to all of those systems that I think that everyone has a lot of reason to be happy about. And we're only just getting started. So let's talk about the big topic that was revealed, which is Hearthstone's very first class, Demon Hunter. And a lot of people who've listened to me talk about Hearthstone for a long time know that I've always been skeptical of adding a new class in Hearthstone, and I'm still, frankly, even sort of hearing the explanations of Demon Hunter. I am a little skeptical as whether Demon Hunter is something that the game needs. But I think that it is something that, at least from an excitement perspective, the game can benefit from, right? Like, when you think about it too, you know, does a game like Call of Duty or whatever, these games that have franchises that come out every year, do they need to have a new version released? Well, no, but in order to keep people interested, keep people excited, in a world that has so many new things coming all the time, having something new that can bring interest and excitement back to the game is a valuable thing. And, you know, building that community that is interested and possibly like revisiting or visiting the game for the first time is beneficial for, you know, everyone. Easier to get good games, etc., etc., etc. So I'm still, like I said, a little bit skeptical about Demon Hunter, but I have had a chance to play it a few times, both during the actual reveal stream and during the summit that happened a while ago. And it's fun. You know, it does kind of have its own feeling to it. The one-cost hero power does kind of set it apart from other classes in terms of how it interacts with attacking triggers, things that care about, you know, not really main things that you care about using your hero power, but say there are. You know, those work well with Demon Hunter because they're just cheaper to use. It works well with, you know, like life-steal weapons, the fact that you give your weapon a buff, or you give yourself a buff, rather than just creating a weapon like Rogue does make it feel like it fights and plays out differently. The implications are different than a lot of other classes. You know, I'm excited for it. I think that it will be a very interesting thing to sort of add to the Hearthstone universe, and obviously the fact that it will bring a bunch of extra eyes because it is a big, new, exciting thing rather than just another expansion, I think is very valuable to the Hearthstone community, sort of broadly speaking. Their sort of kit of stuff feels like very interesting mapped out. You know, they have early attacking stuff, they have like their sacrifice stuff, they have like their big demon plan, they even have like AoE, which, you know, Rogue doesn't have. So they kind of feel like a mishmash of Rogue, Hunter, and Warlock to a certain extent, but like without some of the elements of each of them. They're not like, you know, a direct damage class in quite the same way that either Rogue or Hunter are, and they don't really sacrifice their own guys like Warlock, but they profit from their death. You know, frankly, like Hearthstone, all the Hearthstone classes kind of have overlap in terms of how they play, how they feel, what sort of things they do, and it feels like the overlap of things in Demon Hunter is unique enough that it has its own space to live in. And also, Blizzard has gotten better at making Hearthstone over time. Like, that's something that I think is important to recognize when you look at, like, making changes to the classic set, making changes to the basic set, adding a new class now. What makes a class fun, what combination of things are cool and interesting are something that they have a better grasp on now than they did when they made the original classes. So I think that, you know, like, especially compared to something like Old Priest, which, we'll get to the Priest situation in a little bit. I think that Demon Hunter feels like it's actually in a very good spot and has a lot of cool different things that it can do, and I'm excited to build decks for it. I like the fact that they are approaching it from you kind of have this initiate set, which is a backlog of Year of the Dragon cards, and they're getting a bit more cards than the other classes. Also, crucially, if you look at each of the individual Demon Hunter cards, they are on average stronger than other classes, which isn't to say that Demon Hunter cards are overpowered, but it's that there are fewer weak cards in Demon Hunter. There are some cards in a lot of classes that are kind of like class identity type cards. There's stuff like the Tome of Intellect, in Mage or whatever. Things that exist largely to be like, this is the kind of theme that this class has. Demon Hunter doesn't really have those type of cards that are just class identity cards, right? Everything seems like it fits a role of identifying what the class does, but also fits the role of going into a deck. So there aren't the Tome of Intellects and the Mind Visions and things like that like aren't really powerful enough and exist primarily just to showcase what the class is about. So I think that's part of why it feels like Demon Hunter can be competitive right out the gate rather than having to wait to catch up, simply because it doesn't have as many cards as other classes. It will always be sort of hamstrung and wild in that way to some degree, perhaps. But if the same sort of baseline power level of the cards remains relatively high, or at least relatively higher, and they're getting more cards than the other classes are, because they're getting 15 per set for this year rather than 10. I think that they may even catch up in Wild to some degree, though there's the question of, well, they don't get access to a lot of the stuff that was kind of busted back then before the Hearthstone developers knew quite how powerful certain effects were. They don't have secrets, so they can play with Mad Scientist. They can't play like Kazakus or whatever, so we'll see. But overall, I'm excited for Demon Hunter, and I'm definitely going to be playing, I'm sure, a lot of it, as the rest of the world is too, when it does release very soon. Next up, I want to talk about the Hall of Fame. Hall of Fame has always been kind of a controversial subject in Hearthstone, and this year I think there's a couple of particularly controversial inclusions in the Hall of Fame. So the cards that are being Hall of Famed this year, if you did not see, are Leroy Jenkins, Mountain Giant, Mind Control Tech, Spellbreaker, and Acolyte of Pain. I have personally advocated for the Hall of Faming of several of these. I mean, lots of people have been advocating for Leroy to be Hall of Famed, but basically the explanation for Leroy being Hall of Famed was exactly what you might expect. Leroy has been ending games in the same way since the dawn of time in Hearthstone, and kind of blurs the lines between classes. When you die to a Leroy out of Rogue, or Hunter, or Aggro Warrior, or whatever, it's like, okay, well, this is just the same thing killing me in all of these. And in particular, I would say Rogue is the biggest culprit because of Shadow Step. Leroy Shadow Step has killed me so many times throughout Hearthstone's history that, it kind of drives you crazy, right? Like, when Rogue is the best deck in a format, I actually posted something about this not that long ago, that I feel like kind of the most frustrated, because the games in the beginning feel the same because of stuff like SI and Backstab and whatnot, and end the same because of like Leroy Shadow Step. So the game just kind of feels like the same game I've played for 6 years, and when that's what I run into all the time, it just feels so repetitive. So I've been advocating for Leroy to get Hall of Fame for a while. I'm very happy to see him go. Same thing for Mountain Giant. I actually contended that Mountain Giant should have been Hall of Famed when there was the Conjurer Mage decks that were really popular, and in particular, the combination with Conjurer's Calling was super gross. But I've long contested that Mountain Giant was a ever-present threat in any kind of deck that looks to have a big hand, and kind of made it difficult to play anything else, to design anything else that's interesting and competitive in that slot without it being truly overpowered, because Mountain Giant's already so good. We already saw Molten Giant go to the Hall of Fame a long time ago, and that pair, I think Mountain Giant's actually probably mostly the stronger one of them, because it can go into more shells and is less sort of like dangerous than Molten Giant, but the pair of them needed to be broken up for the handlock strategies that were so popular, at least back then. And now finally Mountain Giant has found his way to the Hall of Fame beside his buddy Molten Giant. And again, obviously very happy to see this happen, because it does open up a lot more design space, right? You can have things that like individual classes can have that's their big hand thing, that is attractive because it's not just every single class that draws cards and has a big hand looking to Mountain Giant. It just more games feel the same when, in particular, a powerful neutral is as ubiquitous and as powerful as Mountain Giant has been this whole time. So happy to see that go. And I think that almost every single human being on the face of the planet is happy to see Mind Control Tech go. It's a kind of in a different category, but obviously the sheer randomness and the impact of the randomness, not only the fact that it has randomness, but the like degree of impact of the randomness with Mind Control Tech is bigger than most other cards. You know, like if this hits the Mountain Giant, right? Like on a board of 4 minions, look, I win. If it hits, you know, the 1/1, oh, I lose. And that being something that, yes, you can play around it by not playing a 4th minion, but you know, as a game that like is largely about like trying to create boards and battle with minions, saying, you know, just never play a 4th minion because anyone in the world could have a Mind Control Tech because it's a neutral card, is a pretty frustrating experience to have. Again, throughout Hearthstone's history, so that being Hall of Famed after already getting the boot from Arena like a year ago or so, I think is something that pretty much everyone's happy about. I have seen a lot of people complaining and questioning the Hall of Faming of Acolyte of Pain and Spellbreaker, and a lot of them are like, oh, these cards clearly aren't too powerful, you know, they're not like cards that like you put into every deck, and that's sort of not exactly the point. The point, as Dean explained during the reveal stream, is much more that these are just neutral effects that have been around for a very long time, and kind of, in the case of Acolyte of Pain, give you this critical mass of neutral card draw in the classic set that means that a lot of decks that want to draw a lot of cards look the same, and have always looked the same. They're the, you know, Loot Hoarder, Novice Engineer, Acolyte of Pain, like package that you have there, that any kind of like combo deck will often play. And Acolyte, I think, is clearly the most powerful of those in that it can draw you up to 3 cards. And just seeing, you know, that card over and over and over and over means that there's less opportunity to create new card draw effects for individual classes or in neutral that are attractive to people simply because Acolyte of Pain is already there and already so good. Similarly with Spellbreaker, it's not that Spellbreaker is overpowered, it's that Spellbreaker kind of crowds out the possibility of making other interesting silence effects, either in neutral or in classes. And I like the example that Dean gave of Gluttonous Ooze. That Gluttonous Ooze was, you know, this weapon removal effect that you had the ability to consider using while it wasn't standard because, well, you know, it's really good specifically against like aggressive decks that are trying to kill you with weapons like Pirate Warrior, but wouldn't necessarily have a home if, you know, there's like just such a tight power band between Spellbreaker and like Ironbeak Owl, which was already nerfed, by the way. So having like a medium weak neutral silence effect in the classic set in the form of Ironbeak Owl rather than just solid, fairly powerful one in the form of Spellbreaker, I think is better. So you can move forward and make new neutral or class-based silence minions to give you more differentiation in the sort of things that people are playing in order to silence stuff. Like, you know, I can't even count the number of decks that I've played that have just been like, oh, look, there's Carnivorous Cubes, there's Void Lords, there's buff stuff. I'll just throw in my 2 Spellbreakers and call it a day. And you want that to change over time. It's more interesting and more fun when the play patterns shift as new cards come out and new sets are released. And that's why Hall of Faming cards that aren't necessarily like too good on a raw power level point, like Acolyte and Spellbreaker, I think is both a good and important thing. Next up, we have a subject which I've alluded to a few times, which is near and dear to my heart, which is the Priest changes to the classic set and basic set as well. As someone who has long advocated for both significant revisions to the classic and basic sets and significant changes to Priest's core gameplay patterns, I love the philosophy behind what they did to Priest in the classic and basic sets. If you look at the cards that were being Hall of Famed, which are Akanai Soul Priest, Holy Fire, Shadow Form, Prophet Felon, Divine Spirit, and Northshire Cleric, you see 2 things happening. One is the removal of major offenders in terms of play pattern and power level, which are Divine Spirit and Northshire Cleric. Divine Spirit, I think, has been just an oppressively powerful card in a lot of different metagames. There's been times when Divine Spirit Inner Fire Priest was just totally meme, and there's been times when it has been the best deck in a format. Mostly, I think it just leads to the same play pattern happening over and over. If you are playing as the Priest, you leave any minion in play, especially any minion with a reasonable amount of health, you're dead. You know, you can die like literally turn 4 or whatever against a lot of things, or and that's just like not very fun as something which exists all the time. Having like a Divine Spirit Inner Fire deck be something that existed during an expansion year and then was gone would be one thing, but having it be something which exists as part of Priest's basic and classic set in its entirety ends up meaning that you just have this fundamental play pattern that opponents have to be afraid of, and frankly, as a Priest player, you kind of feel pressured into playing in a lot of decks, even if you don't want to, because the number of decks that I built over time, you know, as a Priest player, Priest my most played class, I have like 4,000 something wins as Priest, and almost all of those are like slow controlling decks, not Inner Fire decks. A lot of times I'd be like, okay, I want to build this like mid-range Priest deck, and then I'd play it for a bit, and I'm like, you know what, this is just a bad version of Divine Spirit Inner Fire Priest, and that is a really bad feeling as a player who wants to experiment with a variety of different kind of archetypes and strategies in a class, is feeling like everything that you try to make is a worse version of something which exists and has existed and will exist forever. And that's kind of the issue with Divine Spirit Inner Fire being the classic set. Similarly, Northshire Cleric, I think, is another card where it's more about the play pattern, the raw power level, and the sort of class identity. Cleric is something that is incredibly oppressive in a lot of matchups when you play it early in the game, or when you play it late in the game and can combine it with stuff like Wild Pyromancer and Circle of Healing. And card draw isn't supposed to be a thing that's part of like Priest's core class identity. Literally the only ways to draw cards in Priest for a long time were stuff like Northshire Cleric and Power of Shield. And the only way to draw like a lot of cards was always Northshire Cleric. And I think that is, you know, fundamentally problematic when like one of your best cards does something that your class isn't really supposed to be like great at. You know, Priest has been like kind of the card stealing class with stuff like Thought Steal and whatnot. And Northshire Cleric was good and Thought Steal was always bad. So having the thing that your class is supposed to do be something they're actually bad at, and the thing that your class is just kind of has as a very small component with exactly Cleric being something which is like all the highlight reels of the decks, I think is, you know, clearly a problem. And it's also just like, you know, the number of games that are decided, oh, you had Cleric early, I can't play my minion because you'll just draw off your Cleric, also super frustrating. And I think that while Cleric is obviously a core element of power for Priest as it has existed, I think that it going away opens up a lot more options for Priest, because you don't just have to be like, okay, well, you know, I can't give you this like AoE heal that's any good because you'll just draw a ton of cards off with Northshire Cleric. If you're doing things other than just drawing a bunch of cards with Cleric off of these like healing effects, they can possibly just be better themselves. It's not just like, okay, this is gone. It's, okay, this being gone allows for other cards to be made that could possibly be completely busted with these. We see this with, you know, Divine Spirit and one of the new cards being added, which I'll get to momentarily, that have a big health buff that we've seen in previous versions that cost more. But now, because Divine Spirit is gone, it can, you know, actually be more reasonably costed for non-Divine Spirit cases. The other cards, Soul Priest, Holy Fire, Shadow Form, and Velen, are all cards that kind of, as I said, spoke to a dream that they're not supporting anymore. And in particular, I think that Prophet Velen is a great example of a card that like looks cool when you're like a newer player, and then you realize like it's actually not good, and you've like been kind of hurting yourself every time that you play it over like just something better. It's basically like, you know, it's a War Golem that, unless you're playing a bunch of burst, like Mind Blast, which already got Hall of Famed, you know, you just have this bad legendary. Similarly, I love Shadow Form, but Priest, you know, being about direct damage, as like, you know, the Shadow Form, Holy Fire, Velen, Soul Priest plus whatever sort of thing combos, just led the Priest having this very like assemble a bunch of cards in my hand and blow you up strategy, which A, is like not the sort of thing that they want Priest to do. It won't be more about like controlling the board and winning in other capacities, and B, would all be way worse getting rid of Northshire Cleric too, which already violates these things we talked about. I think this is generally a good direction. You know, these are cards that don't really work with the core Priest direction, strategy, identity, whatever you want to call it. And I think that getting rid of them is generally a good thing for the class, because they're replaced by things that are, you know, more effective in their their new direction. Let's talk about those new cards. Power Infusion, Kol Turan Chaplain, Psychic Conjurer, Scarlet Subjugator, Shadowed Ruin, and Natalie Celine. First of all, as I mentioned, Power Infusion, you actually have a +2/+6 for 4 baseline buff. I don't think this is necessarily like crazy good or anything, but remember, only Divine Spirit is gone. Inner Fire still exists, so you can still play a deck that's looking to like make a big minion off of these health buffs, and the health buffs naturally keep them alive, make them easier for you to actually heal with your hero power. So I think that this and the Kol Turan Chaplain can very reasonably be totally reasonable cards, totally decent cards. The Chaplain in particular, there have been a bunch of similar sort of minions in Priest history that have all been very good, and being able to actually play a Priest deck that looks to play a thing, buff it, keep it around, heal it, without it just all being about, okay, I'm going to try and keep this on the board and either blow you up with Divine Spirit or just keep drawing cards with Northstar Cleric, I think leads to much more possible diversity in play experiences for Priest. Scarlet Subjugator is interesting both as a card that can combine with Cabal Shadow Priest in the core set, as well as something that can interact with, like, say, Shadow Word Pain type stuff. Shadow Ruin actually gives Priest a actual AoE clear in the base set, which they've only really had previous, like Akanai plus Circle, or a terrible inefficient Holy Nova, which is no longer so bad. We'll get to in a sec. So I think this is actually like a really good inclusion. You don't just have to have every new expansion have like a new Priest AoE in order to keep up and have this kind of massive inflation in AoEs in the in Wild for Priest as well. So overall, I think this is a really good inclusion. And then, of course, Natalie Celine, the new legendary, so much more useful in a wide variety of decks than Prophet Velen. Velen was something, as I mentioned before, you really only ever played in a burst-focused deck. Otherwise, you were almost universally making a mistake. And frankly, this is a card that you can put into almost any Priest deck, and you're like, I'm happy with this. It's board control, it's a big minion by itself, and that is something that you can actually get out of your pack and be like, ooh, this is awesome, rather than Prophet Velen, you're like, okay, well, I don't play a combo deck, so this isn't any good. Or there is no combo deck in the current metagame, so this isn't any good. This actually gives them a legendary that they can use a lot and be happy about. So Psychic Conjurer, the last one, I think is sort of the Mind Vision card of these, right? This is basically, okay, this is something that further establishes the Priest identity of stealing your opponent's cards. I think it's probably just pretty bad, frankly, as a 1/1 for 1 that gives you what seems to be just a random card. It's not even Discover. But there's room for, these sort of identity-defining things in the basic set, where this is, replacing Northstar Cleric, but we don't really want to think about it in the sense of like, okay, well, they get this instead of Northstar Cleric. It's like, no, there's all these other changes that go along with it too. So speaking of those other changes, more cards being generally buffed. One, I think, pretty clear nerf. Powered Shield now costs 0, but doesn't draw a card. On the one hand, yes, they're nerfing Powered Shield, which was arguably the best Priest classic set card. On the other hand, the best Priest card being 1 mana, give something +0/+2, draw a card, isn't really exciting, right? You basically only really played that because it drew you a card, and you pretty much started almost every single Priest deck with 2 copies of Powered Shield, unless it was an incredibly minion-light deck, and that's kind of boring. So I think opening up more sort of space for other things to be good in Priest, and not just having like every Priest deck start at 28 cards because of Powered Shield, I think opens up more sort of diversity in deck building. Overall, if you look at like the other cards that are changed, Holy Smite, Holy Nova, Shadow Madness, Thought Steal, Temple Enforcer. Most of these are cards that were already played, right? Almost every one of these cards, with the exception of Temple Enforcer, I have personally played in like a deck that I legitimately felt was competitive, and all of them are getting better. Yes, Holy Smite and Holy Nova don't kill your opponent anymore, but they're way better for board control. And now I think Temple Enforcer is actually legitimately a reasonable minion to put into your deck. +3 health on a 5/6 for 5, I think is a totally reasonable combination of stats and effect. And if you're playing kind of a mid-range Priest deck, which, as I mentioned before, I love to do, this is a pretty compelling option. So I am, overall very excited about the Priest changes. I do have some concern that being essentially a control and board-focused class can leave Priest vulnerable to stuff like Control Warrior, right? Like, I always hated playing any kind of mid-range Priest deck against Control Warrior who just brawl me and whatnot. But obviously, there's lots of stuff that can come out in expansions to give you different ways to deal with these things. If you really look to it, You know, almost any sort of priest deck has these like incredible value engines, like the priest Galakron, right? Being able to play the priest Galakron with these new, better control tools in kind of like a mid-range shell, I think is really appealing to me and exactly the style of game that I like to play. And knowing that Blizzard wasn't really going to support the kind of combo burst style that existed before, which again I was never a fan of, you know, makes me feel pretty good about a lot of these changes moving forward. So I am excited to play a lot more Priest once all these changes are in place, and there's just a lot more new and interesting things to try and do with the class. And lastly, but certainly not least, during the stream we announced the Ashes of Outland expansion. And first of all, I want to say, as I said during the stream itself, Dave Kozak is a national treasure. If you haven't actually watched the announcement video, it's hilarious. And I love just the sort of quirky, weird, irreverent style of humor that they have, both in Hearthstone itself and in these sort of announcements and whatnot. It's a blast, and I highly recommend you go watch it if you haven't already. But I'm really excited for Ashes of Outland for a number of reasons. One, it looks like there's tons of cool cards. The primes are, I think, really interesting. They really remind me of Golden Monkey or like Storm Guardian, things that like you have these really powerful cards you can't necessarily put in your deck directly, but like you kind of complete this mini quest to get them. And they all seem like they're totally reasonable things to start, and you know, getting these just like big late game exciting kind of like bomb type cards out of them I think is really cool. Imprison Demons as a mechanic, I think you know, again is really interesting. The fact that they provide you with this window to make decisions as to, okay, how do I want to play around this thing that's coming for me? You know, I know it's going to happen, right? Whether it's Imprisoned Observer or Imprisoned Satyr, like, do I want to have try and figure out some way to play around both the AoE damage coming from Observer, or maybe, you know, try and figure out how to best pressure my opponent to try to, you know, disrupt their ramp effect from Imprisoned Satyr. I think very, very cool as well. Overall, I'm just generally really excited about the theme of Outland. I played a ton of World of Warcraft. I mentioned on the stream that I was the first level 70 on my server. I was on Ner'zhul. If you happen to have been on Ner'zhul during classic, it's not classic, vanilla, whatever you want to call it, original WoW, Burning Crusade, and you were on Ner'zhul, you probably knew me and my guild. I was Elendril of Lost Anarchy. If you also played the WoW TCG, that was my WoW character. That was the hunter hero in the very first set, the Alliance. But anyway, just lots of cool stuff that's very nostalgic. Lots of things that really like kind of bring me back to those days, and I'm really excited. Obviously, a great time to include Demon Hunter as well, with the sort of tie-in to Outland and Illidan having been the villain during the Burning Crusade expansion. I obviously am going to talk more about the individual cards in the set in future videos, and on our reunion episode of Omnistone, which is going to be happening. But for now, I think we're going to leave it at that. Lots more, of course, to talk about an individual level, whether it is the Demon Hunter cards, the Outland cards, and whatnot. But I've already talked for quite a while, and we can have those be part of a future video. So anyway, thank you guys very much for tuning in. I hope you guys are as excited for the Year of the Phoenix and the future of Hearthstone as I am. Let me know what you think in the comments, what you're looking forward to the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.